So in this section, we're going to talk about containers, specifically the Azure Kubernetes service, which is a managed Kubernetes service for Azure. If we go into the create a resource section, and we can see that containers has its own section. The Azure Container Service Kubernetes is the first item. We're also going to talk about container instances, which are a much simpler way of deploying code that is containerized. But we're going to start with Azure Kubernetes Service. So what exactly is a container and why would you want to use one? Well, containers are sort of a midway point between a purely infrastructure as a service, a virtual machine solution where you completely control the environment, and the web apps and the platform as a service solution where you don't control the environment. So in a web apps solution, you package up your code, you zip that up and put that into the Azure service, and Azure will deploy and run it as it sees fit. You can set a number of instances, put it into an app service plan, etc. But a Kubernetes container is basically a way for you to package your code, and the package itself contains all of the dependencies, everything that it needs to run. And so you're deploying your code as a package into Azure. Now the great thing about Kubernetes is it is open source. I believe it was invented by Google, but it is available on all of the major cloud platforms. So if you create code for the Kubernetes service, you can deploy to Azure, you can deploy to the Google Cloud Platform, you can deploy to Amazon AWS. That's certainly not true about something like web apps or even the serverless functions like Azure Service Fabric or functions and logic apps. A lot of that stuff is fairly unique to Azure. The containerized solution is a way of you to package your code and deploy it to any environment. The other benefit, of course, is that it makes it very easy to get up and running with some code. Now, I've worked in environments where it's taken a day and a half to get your local developer desktop up and running, compiled of all of the projects across all of the different things. You want to get the full environment going. That is a day and a half of work to get going. Even though the documentation is very clear, it's just how long it takes to download all that stuff and get everything compiled. If they were using a containerized solution, you'd be able to pull the container out of the container repository and it would have everything it's need in that container. You wouldn't need to do a lot of extra installs and get all the DLLs and register with the Windows registry, etc. Now, the creation for a Kubernetes cluster very much reminds us of the creation for a virtual machine. It's also similar to when we were creating our batch service earlier. We choose our subscription. In my case, it's the pay-as-you-go. You might have a free plan, you might have enterprise plan, or you might be have your MSDN subscription. It's going to be different for all of us. You do need to put your Kubernetes cluster into a resource group. I'm going to continue on with the resource groups that I've been using. I've been just deleting resources. We can see that the deletion is in progress. So as I go through this course, I've been deleting stuff. But resource groups are great for keeping resources together, and it makes it very easy to clean up after. So we have to give the cluster a name. So I'm going to call this new cluster, very original name. There is a naming convention here, but it does not have to be unique across all of Azure. It's just unique across the resource group. I'm going to place this in Central US. We do get to choose a Kubernetes version. Now, default is the latest. For me, it's 1.11.5. But if you do have specific needs for version, then you can choose from it. Maybe you want to have consistency between your different environments. And we're going to have to give this new cluster a prefix. So the DNS prefix is basically going to be used as a fully qualified domain name. So when you're managing clusters using the API, you're going to be using this. I'm just going to use the same name for the cluster. Okay. Now, because you're creating what's a cluster, it is more than one computer. There is an orchestration node, and then there are going to be one or more worker nodes. It's starting off with the DS2 VM size, that contains 2 CPUs and 7 gig of memory. And you'll notice that it starts off asking for 3 nodes. Okay. Now we can obviously create our clusters to be more. Now I have a restriction on my account where I think I've got a 10 CPU limit in this demo account. So at the current time I could not create a 100 node cluster, but we can create anything from 1 to 100. And remember, the number of CPUs is dictated by the VM size. So let's create that 3 node cluster. I wonder if I can just type here. Virtual nodes are not available in Central US. Okay, so if I wanted to try this virtual nodes service, then we would could use Central US, but that's not available for where I am. Okay, so I'm going to do a 3 node cluster that has 2 CPUs each. Now we can service principal is basically the account under which the nodes are going to run. And so by default here, it's going to create me a brand new account under my Active Directory that will be managed by Azure, that will be assigned to this nodes cluster. And so I can basically configure very specific security settings for this, and it wouldn't run as administration. I could obviously enable this RBAC or keep it disabled. I won't touch that for now. We'll leave the networking settings to be the default. I won't enable, well, the monitoring is enabled by default. I'm going to turn that, I'm going to leave that as yes. We haven't got into Azure Monitor yet. And, when we get down to the monitoring and troubleshooting section of this course, we'll talk more about Azure Monitor. We'll just leave that turned on for now. I won't be using tags at this time. And we can see here on the review screen all of which what we're creating. So keep in mind that this DS2 cluster has a certain price to it, and I'm creating 3 of them. So when I create this AKS, it does have the ability to run up costs fairly quickly unless you keep the cluster turned off. So in the next video, we're going to create this cluster, and then we'll start deploying code to it.